Hollywood is no stranger to tragedy, but the shocking death of legendary actor Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa at their secluded Santa Fe mansion has shaken the entire nation. At first, the case seemed straightforward. Two elderly individuals, possibly victims of natural causes. But as investigators dig deeper into the final moments of their lives, unsettling details have begun to emerge, painting a picture far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The circumstances surrounding their deaths have raised countless questions, and every new clue only adds to the mystery. There were no signs of forced entry, no visible struggle, and yet something about the scene didn't sit right with the forensic team. The way their bodies were found, the scattered objects, the strange positioning. It was as if the house itself held a secret that no one had yet uncovered. Gene Hackman was discovered lying motionless near the back door, his cane and sunglasses close by, as if he had tried to move but collapsed before reaching his destination. He was known to rely heavily on those items, and their placement suggested he had been conscious before his final moments. His skin showed signs of extreme dehydration, indicating that he had been dead for days before anyone found him. This alone was alarming. How could a man of his stature and wealth be left in such a deteriorated state without anyone noticing? Betsy was found on the bathroom floor, surrounded by spilled pills, an open prescription bottle sitting on the counter. It looked like she had been in the middle of something, maybe trying to take medication in an emergency. But there were no clear signs of an overdose. If she had been poisoned, why weren't there any immediate symptoms pointing to it? The most unsettling part was an overturned heater lying near her body. Had she tried to reach for it in a moment of weakness? Or had there been an accident, an event so unexpected that it sent everything spiraling out of control? One of the most disturbing realizations was that neither of them had died instantly. The forensic team concluded that they had suffered a prolonged period of physical decline, slowly wasting away. But if it had been natural causes, why hadn't they called for help? Why hadn't Betsy, presumably still mobile, attempted to reach out to someone before succumbing to whatever had taken over? Adding to the confusion, the front door was found wide open, yet nothing in the house was disturbed. No valuables were missing, no signs of forced entry. So who had left it open? Did one of them attempt to escape? Or had someone been inside that house and walked out, leaving it ajar? If a crime had taken place, it was executed with surgical precision, leaving behind only questions and speculation. Even more unsettling was the condition of their pets. One of their dogs had starved to death, while two others were barely clinging to life, clearly malnourished. This detail alone suggested that Hackman and Betsy had been in distress long before their deaths. A couple known for their love of animals would never neglect them unless they were physically incapable of providing care. As investigators searched for answers, they considered every possible theory. Had they been slowly poisoned over time, their health deteriorating until they could no longer function? The toxicology reports would be crucial in determining whether an external agent had played a role. But if someone had deliberately introduced a poisonous substance, how had it been administered without either of them noticing? And more importantly, who would have wanted to harm them? An alternative theory suggested that one of them had fallen ill first, leaving the other to struggle alone, ultimately leading to their shared fate. If Gene had suffered a medical emergency, Betsy might have desperately tried to help him, only to collapse herself from exhaustion and stress. But this theory had its own inconsistencies. If Betsy had been the one to survive longer, why hadn't she called for help? There were no emergency calls, no notes left behind, just silence. Then there was the mysterious phone call. A single brief call had been made from a green mobile phone inside the house, but it was abruptly cut off after just a few seconds. Who had made that call? Gene? Betsy? Or someone else? The timing of the call suggested that whoever dialed it had been desperate. perhaps trying to reach someone for help before being interrupted. But interrupted by what? And what about the state of their finances? Gene Hackman was a man of immense wealth, with multiple properties and royalties from decades in Hollywood. Was there someone who stood to gain from his passing? A review of his financial records revealed some peculiar changes leading up to his death. Canceled meetings, altered schedules, even an abrupt withdrawal of funds. Was this just a coincidence, or was there something more sinister at play? Family tensions only deepened the mystery. While Gene had always been private about his personal life, it was no secret that there had been disputes, particularly with his son. Insiders whispered about arguments over inheritance, money, and property, fueling speculation that perhaps the motive behind their deaths wasn't as random as it seemed. Could a family member have played a role? Had a visit to the Santa Fe mansion taken a dark turn? Hackman's personal journal, found in his study, contained cryptic entries that investigators are still trying to decode. One entry, written just days before his death, hinted at something troubling. "I need to get things in order before it's too late," he had scribbled. Too late for what? As forensic teams continued their investigation, the evidence only led to more chilling questions. Why had no one heard from them in days? Why had their bodies been left undiscovered for so long? And if this was all just an unfortunate series of events, why did every detail suggest otherwise? What really happened inside that mansion in Santa Fe? Investigators were determined to piece together the final hours of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa, but every answer led to more disturbing possibilities. If their deaths had been a simple case of natural causes, why did everything surrounding them feel so deeply unnatural? One of the most compelling theories suggested that both had been exposed to a toxic substance, either gas or a slow-acting poison. The symptoms aligned with gradual poisoning, dehydration, disorientation, and exhaustion. If they had unknowingly inhaled a toxic gas, such as carbon monoxide, it could explain their inability to seek help. But forensic tests quickly ruled that out. No traces of hazardous gas were found in the home, and the ventilation system was intact. So if it wasn't gas, could they have ingested something lethal? The discovery of Betsy's scattered pills suggested she had been in distress, perhaps searching for medication to help Gene or herself. But there was no clear evidence of an overdose. If she had taken the wrong dosage in a state of confusion, wouldn't at least one of the pill bottles have been empty? Instead, everything seemed haphazardly placed, as if she had been interrupted before taking any action. Then there was the heater, knocked over near Betsy's body. A small detail, but one that could be crucial. Did she try to reach for it in her final moments? Or had something, or someone, caused it to fall? If she had collapsed due to illness, the heater's position might have been incidental. But if there had been an altercation, it could suggest an entirely different scenario, one involving a struggle that left no visible wounds. Another theory gained traction. One of them had fallen ill first, and the other had desperately tried to save them. Gene had been growing frail in his later years, and while he still maintained a routine of short walks and mild physical activity, age had taken its toll. What if he had suffered a stroke or heart attack? Betsy, in a panic, might have tried to administer medication, only to succumb to stress and exhaustion herself. But this theory had glaring holes. If Gene had suddenly collapsed, Betsy, fully conscious and capable, would have called for help. Even in a state of panic, she would have reached for a phone, contacted emergency services, or even walked outside for assistance. Yet, there was no evidence that she had made any effort to do so. The one and only phone call from inside the house, a brief, aborted call from the green mobile phone, stood out as a critical clue. If Betsy had been trying to call for help, why was the call cut off after just a few seconds? And if it wasn't her, who had made that call? As investigators dug into the timeline, they found something even more unsettling. Gene's phone contained a series of messages hinting at a conflict with a family member. Messages that had been deleted but later recovered. Some seemed routine, but others suggested tension, particularly surrounding financial matters. One message, sent days before his death, simply read, "We need to talk. It can't wait." The theory of family involvement became harder to ignore. Gene's relationship with his son had been strained for years, particularly over money and inheritance. Was it possible that their deaths were not an accident, not an illness, but the result of something much darker? Some investigators considered the possibility of an outside party, an intruder who knew exactly how to stage a scene without leaving behind evidence. But the front door had been left wide open and nothing was stolen. If this had been a burglary gone wrong, there would have been signs of a break-in, missing valuables, something out of place. Instead, everything was eerily untouched, as if whoever had been there had no interest in theft. Then there was the dogs, the final haunting clue that painted a grim picture. One of their beloved pets had died from starvation, while the others were barely surviving. This meant that Gene and Betsy had been incapacitated for days before they died. If it had been a sudden event, the animals would not have suffered for that long. Whatever had happened to them, it had been slow, deliberate, and inescapable. Toxicology reports were still pending, but the forensic team had already reached a chilling conclusion. Gene and Betsy had not died at the same time. Their conditions suggested that one had passed before the other, meaning that at least one of them had spent hours, or possibly even days, alone with the body of their deceased spouse. Had Gene collapsed first, leaving Betsy to struggle until her own strength gave out? Or had Betsy been the first to go, leaving Gene disoriented, weak, and unable to fend for himself? The idea of a suicide pact was briefly considered, but there was no evidence to support it. No letters, no messages, no indication that either of them had planned for their deaths. In fact, Gene had future plans. Financial records showed recent activity, indicating that he had been making arrangements for something in the near future. If he had been preparing for the end, why would he still be organizing his affairs? Even more troubling was the behavior of Gene's daughters. Just a day after their father and stepmother's bodies were discovered, they were seen at a restaurant, acting as if nothing had happened. No tears, no visible grief, just calm, collected faces, raising their glasses in what some witnesses described as a casual manner. One of his daughters, when interviewed, dismissed the entire case as a tragedy of old age. But why were they so quick to accept it, when so many details pointed to something more complex? If they truly believed their father had died naturally, why weren't they demanding a full investigation? The contradictions only piled up. Gene's health had been stable according to close friends, yet his daughter claimed he had been declining for a while. Betsy had been active and energetic, yet she had supposedly lost the ability to call for help when her husband collapsed. The open door, the scattered pills, the untouched valuables, all of it painted a picture that didn't make sense. Then came the most startling discovery yet. Hidden in a drawer in Gene's study was an envelope, sealed and marked with only one word: urgent. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "If anything happens to me, look deeper." The note had no date, no details, but its message was clear. Gene had feared something, and whatever he had been afraid of, it had come to pass. As investigators examined his finances, recovered deleted messages, and reconstructed the timeline of events, one thing became clear. This was no simple tragedy. The pieces didn't fit. Someone was hiding something, and the truth about what happened inside that mansion was far more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The investigation was far from over. As the days passed, the investigation into Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa's mysterious deaths took a darker turn. Every piece of evidence hinted at something sinister, but nothing was definitive. It was as if the truth was dangling just out of reach, obscured by carefully placed details that made the scene look natural. Too natural. The toxicology reports finally arrived, and what they revealed only deepened the mystery. There were no immediate traces of common poisons, no lethal drugs in their systems. However, there were anomalies, unusual compounds in their bloodstream that required further analysis. These substances, while not inherently fatal, could have caused confusion, fatigue, and eventual collapse if administered over a long period. Could they have been slowly drugged? If so, by whom? The biggest question still loomed. Why had neither of them called for help? Betsy had clearly been mobile for some time after Gene's condition deteriorated, and yet there was no evidence that she had made an effort to reach out, except for that single aborted phone call. Investigators traced the green mobile phone's records and found something chilling. It had only one saved contact, a number with no name attached. When authorities attempted to call it, they discovered it had been disconnected. Who had Gene or Betsy been trying to reach in their final moments? And why had the call ended so abruptly? The more investigators dug, the more the timeline didn't add up. The last known sighting of Gene had been nearly a week before his body was found, when a neighbor saw him outside collecting his mail. After that, silence. No more sightings, no phone calls, no activity on any of his financial accounts. It was as if the couple had vanished inside their own home. The open door became an increasingly suspicious detail. Had Gene or Betsy tried to leave, only to collapse before making it outside? Or had someone else been in that house? Someone who had walked out, leaving the door ajar as they departed? Attention turned once again to Gene's family. His daughters had remained unusually quiet throughout the ordeal, refusing interviews and avoiding the press. But behind the scenes, they had already taken steps to claim their inheritance. They weren't pushing for further investigation. They weren't questioning the circumstances of their father's death. They were simply moving on. This didn't go unnoticed. Public suspicion grew as people questioned why Gene's family wasn't demanding answers. Theories swirled. Had there been long-standing tensions? Could there have been an argument, a confrontation that ended in tragedy? A deeper dive into Gene's financial records revealed a shocking discovery. Just a month before his death, he had made changes to his will, removing certain beneficiaries and adjusting the distribution of his wealth. While details of these changes remained confidential, sources close to the investigation suggested that one person had been notably affected: his son. The tension between Gene and his son had been whispered about for years, but no one had ever confirmed the full extent of their disagreements. Had something happened in the final days before Gene's death that escalated beyond control? And then came the final, most chilling clue: the surveillance footage. Although Gene's house had no security cameras, nearby businesses and street cameras captured glimpses of activity in the area. A review of this footage showed a car pulling up to Gene's residence on the night investigators estimated he died. The vehicle was parked for nearly 2 hours before leaving. Authorities worked tirelessly to identify the owner of the car, but the license plate had been partially obscured. What was undeniable, however, was that someone had been there. Someone who had left just as the tragedy unfolded. Theories now ranged from accidental overdose to foul play, with every new piece of evidence leading further into uncertainty. If a third party had been involved, they had executed their plan flawlessly, leaving behind no direct traces, just an eerie collection of inconsistencies that hinted at a bigger, more terrifying truth. The final piece of the puzzle lay in the hands of investigators. They now had Gene's last journal entries, the results of the forensic examination, and the incomplete call records. The evidence didn't provide a clear answer, but it pointed toward something undeniable. Gene and Betsy's deaths were not ordinary. They were not coincidences. Someone, somewhere, knew the truth. But as the investigation continued, as pressure mounted, something unexpected happened. The case was quietly closed. Authorities announced that there was no conclusive evidence of foul play, no arrests, no further inquiry. The deaths of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa were officially ruled as natural causes, compounded by exhaustion and undetermined external factors. And just like that, the truth was buried. Speculation ran wild. Had someone with influence intervened? Had the investigation uncovered something too big to expose? Those who followed the case refused to believe that the deaths were merely the result of old age or neglect. The inconsistencies, the financial changes, the cryptic messages, all of it suggested a cover-up. But without definitive proof, the world was left with only theories. Gene Hackman had spent his life portraying characters who uncovered the truth, who sought justice in the face of corruption. In the end, his own story became one of Hollywood's greatest unsolved mysteries, one that may never be fully explained. Was it a tragic accident? A carefully planned crime? A secret too dangerous to reveal? We may never know.